Just by way of a little introduction, I've been working on rivers now for 36 years, I think, and working outside, and time hasn't been that kind to my face, but I'm the one on this side in that photograph.
If you move over a bit, we're going to see the screen.
Sorry, I stand here. And the reason I put this slide up is because the wizened old hobbit to my left there is a gentleman called Bernard Venables, he was an author and a fabulous artist, and he wrote a series of almost like comic strip books called Mr. Crabtree Goes Fishing, and I had one in my stocking as a Christmas present when I was about 6 years old, and it absolutely inspired me to go down to my local pond and get interested in fishing, and more than that, to try and imagine what lay beneath the water. Because what Bernard was very good at, he was very good at drawing these lovely big plump fish, but in the environment that you would expect to find them. So it was either like an overhanging willow tree, or tresses of flowing weed, fast-flowing gravelly bottomed rivers that you would find trout or barbel. And I finally got to meet the old fella, and he was always, as I say, a hero of mine. But so a little bit about the charity I work for. We are a national charity. We started off as a society of friends who just would write to each other. There was about 10 founding fathers, I think, that started to write to each other and ask questions about management. How do you manage your river to make it better for trout? That was how things really started. And it really expanded and grew and became a society. And then we got charitable status. It must be about 13 years ago now, I think. Compared to RSPB, we're a piffling insignificant charity. We've got about 2,500 members. We'd love to grow it, but every time we recruit new members, unfortunately, a lot of our members have the same colour hair as I have, so quite a few fall off the perch every year, and it's a struggle to get youngsters interested. But we've been very, very successful in the last 8 years since I joined the Trust at actually delivering improvement works. And what we focus on, and what our energy is about habitat and trying to make rivers more diverse and interesting and valuable, mainly for what we would call flow-loving, gravel-spawning fish, of which trout, salmon and sea trout are good examples. But the trout is an iconic species. It's one that everyone recognises as one that requires good quality water for a start. But if you can get a river that's right for a salmonid, a member of the salmon family, the trout, then you can bet your life everything else will be doing very well. We've got quite an active website. We want our website to be a hub for all things to do with rivers and trout, and it's a great resource for people that are interested in restoring habitat to rivers. And there's an awful lot of information on the website, and I urge you to visit it. We've got a whole rake of manuals and help for landowners, local authorities, fishing clubs, conservation charities, wildlife trusts, to help them to manage their rivers. And we've got chalk stream manual, urban river manuals, upland river manuals, you name it, we've got some literature on it. And of course these days you don't exist unless you're on YouTube in the video age, and we've got lots and lots of how-to videos, and we've even got a full-length film on working with rivers. And that's just I don't know if you can make it out there, but I think you can just about see the little furry microphone there. We're just in the middle of making a river there. This chap's a journalist, a chap called John Beer. I think he writes in one of the national newspapers. But we're in the middle there of actually restoring a little bit of bank work on a Hampshire chalk river, because many of the river keepers in the 60s and 70s thought that this was the best way to treat the bank of a lovely rural chalk stream by lining it with wobbly tin. Now, You don't have to be a conservation expert, neither do I, to know that that's not a great thing for water voles, unless they've got drills, that is, and they can actually... and it's not good for trout as well. And what we try and do now is encourage people to move away from this hard vertical revetment and install something like that, which is what we call a faggot bundle. It's basically a bundle of hazel sticks. You just ram them together and you replace the wobbly tin with something soft that will absorb flow and that plants will grow through. Of course, it's not just rural rivers, yet many of our urban rivers have a whole assortment of revetment that holds the bank up. Now, in a built-up area like London Borough of Redbridge, or a lot of the rivers that run through urban areas, you'll see a whole mishmash of different types of bank revetment, ranging from sheet steel piling to vertical concrete. Bag work is a classic, where you just throw in dry concrete bags and they go off and you get a hard bag. All awful stuff, in my humble opinion. And the other thing that really drives me insane is if you go and you happen to paddle along a river, as I do, and you see the backs of people's gardens that back onto rivers, and they've got these wonderfully kept gardens and they look immaculate, and then they either use the bottom of the river as a compost heap, so all of the rubbish, the grass cuttings, the litter goes in the river, or they want to build a deck over the top of it. Nothing for wildlife. And then they get very, very excited then when that hard revetment fails, because the one thing that we do know as river managers is that plants, natural plants, native plants, bind the riverbanks together far more effectively than any man-made material, and of course will last indefinitely. And even sheet steel piling, or the most expensive concrete, has got a limited life and is also incredibly expensive. Let's get the right one. Sorry if I blinded everyone there. You won't be able to read that at the back, don't worry about it. And I'm just going to explain, this is a very, very simple model that we use when we're out and about giving people advice to try and get the result we want. It's very unfashionable these days to be a speciesist like we are in the Wild Trout Trust. These days people talk about ecosystems rather than species, which is quite right. Now, I've got my beloved spotty trout in the middle of that, what I call the three-legged milking stool. That could be a kingfisher, that could be a piece of water milfoil, a native plant, it could be a mayfly. The fact is, in this particular case, I put a trout in, but the point is, these things cannot flourish in rivers unless you've got three basic things right, and that's water quality, so it must be clean enough for your target species, water quantity, and people get confused about water quantity because flow in a river is desperately important. It's not just how deep the water is it moving? And is it moving fast enough to sustain the ecology that you're interested in? So obviously you can have a great big lake and not much water in terms of flow. All you need to do is compensate for evaporation. That doesn't work in a river, and rivers are really under an awful lot of pressure because of abstraction. And certainly for fish like trout to do really very well, you need good, vigorous, strong flows and natural flows. And this is the little bit that the charity I work for specialise in, which is habitat. And whether that habitat is joined up, whether it's what we call connected, and is it varied, and does it provide habitat for all of the life stages of the beasts that you're interested in. And that, as I say, that could be invertebrates, it could be fish, it could be fish-eating birds. One more little model we use, and again I've got lots of fish in my bottle here. It could be a bird, I suppose, because birds at different life stages will be requiring different sorts of habitats in their locality. It's no good if they've got to use up lots and lots of energy to be able to actually get what they need to survive. And one of my jobs when I go out and walk along a piece of river is to try and identify You know, where are the bottlenecks to that population ending up like that, where you've got excellent opportunities for spawning, zillions of tiny little fish like this, lots of juveniles, and ultimately adults like that. So identifying where is that habitat bottleneck and then doing something about it to make it better is something that we think we're pretty good at. In terms of in river, and you'll have to forgive me because my talk is a bit fish-centric, as you can imagine, but for a river to work for fish, when we look at habitat, it's quite complicated because fish require different habitats depending, as I said before, on what size they are. They require a different habitat depending on what time of year it is. They even utilise different habitats at night to daytime. So how you understand that lot, let alone manage it, is tricky. For me, it's one of the things that is quite obvious sometimes, but not always obvious if you haven't spent as much time on rivers as I have, is the fact that for rivers to really work well, they need to be complex in terms of their shape. And sometimes the things that make a river complex in terms of their shape are the things that we're very good at pulling out very, very quickly. And the classic for that is this thing. Whoops, let's go back, sorry about that. Is this, the fallen tree. We used to call this, we had a name for this, we used to call it large woody debris, and we were told by the Environment Agency that calling it debris had negative connotations. So we've got to call it large woody material now. And it's true, because people get very, very excited. Landowners get very excited about a tree that's fallen in a river channel. And they're often on the phone to their local flood defence engineer from the Environment Agency asking for help to pull the trees out. But the reality with trees is that they play a critically important role in shaping what the river looks like. And in this particular one, you can see that you've got these shoals of gravel here, and a deep run down that side where the water's been squirted around the end of the tree. So rather than the channel being wide and square and uniform, it's suddenly got incredibly diverse as a result of the flow biting on that piece of wood and energising the flow, scouring out the gravel and creating all of this habitat. And that makes my heart sing, because I know that this habitat here is fantastic for tiny little fry, which might be spawned in this gravel here, and they'll zoom into the edge. The pool here with this little bit of trailing cover will be fantastic for adult fish. And with any luck, we'll probably find that where the gravel has been energised by the flow, and the tree's fallen over and we get a shaft of light into the channel, that we'll get weed growing, and on that weed we'll get things like species of small mayfly, what we call things like blue-winged olive, which are synonymous with certain plants. You get plants, you get fish, and you'll have also got a nice little perch there, you'll get fish-eating birds. So for me, sometimes pulling out the tree too early can be a disaster. We're going to talk a little bit about flood defence as well, because there's been so much on the television in the last few years, particularly since 2014, about climate change, about flood risk, and about, you know, the poor public who've had water through their front door, and, you know, what should we do about that? And we've had ministers coming on the television, getting on the bandwagon, saying, well, the trouble is the Environment Agency no longer manages rivers the way they used to. What we need to do is make rivers wider and deeper. The reality is the Somerset levels would have flooded in 2014, and all those homes would have flooded, even if those river channels had been dredged 3 times as wide and 3 times as deep. Because the Somerset levels are twice a day below sea level. The water can't actually go anywhere. So we need to find space for water. It's critically important. And reconnecting floodplains, making sure we've got places where we can store water, is the best way to protect urban areas from flooding. I'll get off my hobby horse now. I'm happy to talk about flooding and dredging after the tea interval. So, I've talked a little bit about the importance of getting a physically diverse environment if we want to encourage biodiversity, and again, these are some of the species which are near and dear to my heart. Incidentally, everyone thinks that these are fish. These are actually lamprey, and I think technically they're not really a fish. They're incredibly primitive. If you ever seen them spawning, they're incredible. They actually move stones around. They only pop out of the sediment once a year. They hardly eat anything. They're sort of filter feeders, brook lamprey. But when they pop out and they're on the gravel, the kingfishers love them. And of course, ratty, the water vole, which is really struggling in this country. One of those mammals that's critically endangered, mainly because of our love of trying to buy our wives mink coats in the last century, I think, and obviously the North American mink has got out and vandalised these poor chaps. I was talking to a gentleman at the beginning of the meeting, and I don't think people quite realise the fact that mink are this lovely shape, like a sausage, and they're perfect for going down vole burrows. Whereas, of course, Mr. Otter would also eat a vole if it could get close enough, but can't get inside the burrows without a bit of effort. And invertebrates, things like this, the mayfly, which is a wonderful creature, but you'll only ever see the adult phase of the mayfly for a brief period, as the name suggests, in May, when they hatch from the river and they have this adult phase to their life cycle. But they need clean water, and they need certain types of habitat within water. These chaps are silt lovers. They love sediment rather than gravel. And I don't need to tell anyone in this room about that thing. And what a joy it is to see kingfishers. And they seem to be bouncing back a bit. I know hard winters seem to be the things that give peg kingfishers back. But again, we need rivers with plenty of fish if we want plenty of kingfishers. I spend quite a lot of my time on trying to improve access for migrating fish. I'm running a project along the south coast which is about sea trout. I won't bore everyone too much with trout, but resident brown trout and sea trout are actually the same species. It's just that it's a bit of a genetic trick, if you like. Some trout have learnt to go to sea and get an advantage over resident brown trout by coming back 4 times as large and being able to spread their genes because they can hold more eggs. Now, many of our rivers, and people don't realise this, all along the south coast and indeed into the River Thames, sea trout are poking in, pushing in all the time, trying to actually get access into our river systems. And very often they get so far and then they come up against something like this, a lovely man-made structure, in this particular case a culvert. And this particular chap, this fish was about, I suppose about that large, about 5 pound, a big powerful swimming fish, was trying time and time again. It was swimming up, getting over this anti-erosion apron, which makes migration even worse, getting about a metre or 2 into the culvert and then getting squirted out again. And of course you'd think, oh well, maybe it can get up when the flows drop off and it's not quite, it hasn't rained. But of course when that's just a drizzle of water, it comes over the end of the culvert, and then there's no water at all on the erosion apron, and poor old sea trout still can't get through. And one of the things that my charity does, we design a very, very simple low-cost fish passes or easements to help these chaps get up into these culverts and through. And this is another species which the European eel, which I think Worldwide Fund for Nature had this on their top 10 list of endangered species. The European eel stocks have crashed dramatically over the last 20 years. And this species is incredibly important, both commercially, it's jobs for people, particularly in East London, I understand they quite like them jelly. But also for certain fish-eating birds, bittern absolutely adore eels, and so do herons, and it's a preferred diet of the otter as well. So we need, again, to be able to get eels right up, as far up our river systems as we possibly can. And again, structures like this are incredibly difficult for eels to navigate through. So it's no wonder that they're in trouble. Actually, it's quite interesting. What people don't realise is just how long eels live for. And they can, under certain circumstances, find their way up into a system, and then they'll reside in a lake or a pond, sometimes for as long as 25, 30 years before they get the urge to migrate back to sea. When they suddenly think, do you know what, I'm feeling a bit frisky, I think I might quite like to start my family now. When they silver up, they go silver, they migrate all the way back into the sea, all the way across the Atlantic to the Sargasso Sea where they spawn. Absolutely phenomenal life cycle, one which is pretty poorly understood, and even now I don't think anyone has successfully filmed spawning eels. It's a real mystery. And considering where wildlife photographers go these days, and the sort of films that we see on our television, yet the humble European eel has this incredible life cycle, but it's in trouble, and we need to do everything we can to support it. This might be familiar, more in a sort of in a lowland context, weirs and structures. And again, you don't need to be a fish biologist to know that the fish don't have feathers. They can't actually. They can't actually fly from here to here. So once you put a structure in like that, and this particular one was built by the Victorians, who loved to build things, and you think, well, why was this put into? This is the River Uck in Sussex. Was this put in for some really critically important reason? And the actual reason, when you investigate, you do the research, was to feed a drizzle of water through 3 1-acre ornamental ponds and then back into the river. So the weir is there to hold the level up. They take another channel, back in that woodland over the back there's 3 ponds, and then the outlet comes back down into the Uck. Now, it's not just the fact that nothing can go up. These structures have lots of other problems, because in lowland southern England, when you raise the bed by that much, all of the natural features that you would get in a river as it flows downstream, bends, pools, what we call ripples and glides, are lost, and you actually create a canal of deep, slow-flowing, sluggish water that often goes back for sometimes miles because the gradient is so low. Then what happens over decades and decades is that gradually the bed upstream rises, it fills up with sediment, mud. So you've either got to take that mud out, or you just accept the fact that it's silted up, and eventually the stream reaches a little bit of equilibrium so that at least some of the mud, very fine sediment, is passed through the system. So often these channels, even though people think they're deep, because you can't see the bottom, they're often not very deep, but you've got the bed has risen. So restoring these sections of river to something that functions as an ecosystem is often quite tricky. But it can be achieved even just by slowly reducing the height of the structure. Then what happens is you get what's called a nick point. The riverbed will start eroding back gradually, and over time the features will start to come back into the river channel. They're often associated with a milling site, so they might be medieval, hundreds of years old, so the thought of touching them fills the owners with horror. Often the county archaeologist won't even entertain the idea of going anywhere near modifying them. So they're problematic in terms of trying to restore a naturally functioning river. But sometimes we get lucky, and we can get the necessary permissions to remove the structure and take them out. But then sometimes we're thwarted by the local natives, the public, because if you're born in an area and you're used to walking your dog across that footpath, and you hear the water cascading over that weir, and you've heard it for the last 30 or 40 years, you're horrified at the thought of some outsider like me coming in and taking down your weir. So it's really very, very difficult to try and persuade people that it's a good idea. Lots of other issues associated with weirs as well. Water quality is one. People don't often realise is that the water quality upstream of a structure like that is often much worse than below. And that's because these areas you often get algae, you get, as I say, you get lots of biologically rich sediments settle there, so you get what's called a high biological oxygen demand. So the oxygen in these reaches often sags up and down, day and night, whereas downstream where the river's more vibrant and it moves, those fluctuations are ironed out more. It has to be said that weirs like that, locally there, you'll get very high oxygen because it gets naturally aerated by throwing the water down. But that's not really what we want. And the other thing that we talk about in terms of habitat connectivity is not just on the macro scale, but also on the micro scale as well. And this here, this little patch of gravel here, this is the River Lark in Suffolk, which is a chalk stream. Used to be a canal, a navigation, so it was all dug out and had locks put on it. Like many canals, it fell into disrepair when the railways were invented, the locks were pulled out. And in some places the river has recovered and we've got these shallow gravelly runs. And fish like trout have come back. And this is a trout nest. It's called a red, R-E-D-D. And in the winter the trout excavates that little hole there, and the henfish and the cockfish lay their eggs. The eggs are laid there, the cockfish fertilises them, and then the female bats more gravel and they actually bury the eggs in there. But the point about this slide and why I love it is because of this habitat here. Now, again, I go out and work parties sometimes, particularly fishing clubs are the worst, and I say, right, the first thing we've got to do is get rid of this rubbish. And I'm looking around, I'm thinking, well, where are the plastic bottles and the crisp packets? I don't see rubbish, I see habitat here. So if that comes out, these little trout that pop out the gravel are that size with their egg sac attached, and they come out about this time of year actually. And the first thing they do is go sideways as fast as their little bodies can take them into that thick cover, because if they don't, they're going to get eaten. So the more cover you get associated with spawning sites, the more fish that will come through. A lot of my work, when I walk along a river, I face the river and I look for features and ways of improving river habitat. Many times we have to turn our back on the river and look at the land. So land use, it matters. And I look at that little piece of river corridor there, and my heart will sing, because I know that's a very river-friendly corridor. We've got ancient woodland on the valley slope. We've got a bit of very low-use grazing on the valley floor, and a nice little meandering channel there. That's actually in Surrey. It's less than a mile from the centre of Guildford. So it's not the rural idyll that it might look. And everybody in the towns think the rivers in the countryside are fantastic. There's no issues with the land. Well, there are lots of issues with the land. And this is a little stream. This is actually on Anglesey. This little tiny stream used to be very important for sea trout spawning. They'd run up there in the winter when the flows were great, lay their eggs. And the locals called us in and said, well, we don't seem to be getting sea trout in the stream anymore. And what do you think might be wrong? And of course you turn up and you think, well, we don't have to do too many investigations, because when you're doing arable farming this close to a watercourse, the chances are, as soon as it rains, you're going to get tons of sediment from that field into that watercourse. So all of the gravel, that little nest of eggs that I showed you before, if that sediment gets mobilised off the land and into the river at the wrong time of the year, all those eggs get smothered in nutrient-rich sediment and nothing survives. And this is a familiar tale everywhere across the land, is fairly inappropriate agricultural practices. Have we got any farmers in the audience tonight, by the way? before I get stuck in. Because obviously farmers, and don't get me wrong, I know many farmers are really great friends of mine. Some of them are fantastic conservationists, do great things for our landscape. And then others, you know, don't seem to get it. And this is my local river. This is the sorry, this isn't the river, but the River Valley is just down here. This is the Western Rother. That's the South Downs, and the Rother runs west to east between a greensand scarp and the South Downs. So that's a big mound of chalk up here, and this is all very, very fine sandy soil. And all this soil was lost in one night, one rainfall event. I kid you not, you could almost park a double-decker bus in there. There must have been hundreds and hundreds, thousands of tons of sediment mobilised one night, and it all went down there. Most of it went in the Western Rother. Some of it went on to a local road, which obviously the council taxpayers had to pay for to have all that sediment reduced. And of course, the farmer is getting a subsidy from the taxpayers, as well as obviously this is his business. I get that, and we all need food. But what gets me sometimes is that this particular land, there's 2 or 3 big landowners on I guess it wouldn't be rude to say they're the aristocracy. They've got these very big stately homes. They're very, very keen on preserving the landscape and the stately homes to pass on to the next generations. Yet they seem to be blind to the fact that they're losing the soil on the land at an alarming rate. And this is happening in lots and lots of catchments. And it's a difficult problem to solve. The Environment Agency euphemistically call this diffuse pollution. This is catastrophic pollution on a massive scale, because it's not just the sediment that gets into the river that causes a problem, it's what's bound up to it, you know, often pesticide and nutrient, phosphorus and nitrogen. And as I've got stuck into the old arable farmers, I'll give the sheep farmers a bashing as well. Do any of you read George Monbiot at all? Have you heard of him? Yes. Well, he's written quite a bit about these little lovely little cuddly fellows, and he's advocating actually that we've got far too many sheep on our upland moorland, and that it's causing massive issues in terms of increased flood risk. And I have to say, when sheep densities are high and they absolutely nibble away the grass and everything else to within an inch of its life, this is what happens to river channels. They become heavily eroded and out of sorts, and you lose the ecology. You know, try and persuade farmers that actually we'd be better off with a few less sheep, or wouldn't it be a good idea to put a few drinking bays in and maybe a little bit of fencing? It's sometimes a tough ask. And sometimes even when you offer to pay for the fencing, they still won't have it. And it's not just arable farmers and sheep farmers. Obviously, forestry, and particularly the coniferous forestry, which sort of got kicked off in the post-war years when we needed lots of wood to rebuild our country, and there were massive grants available for planting Douglas fir in upland areas. And in order for these things to grow well, the valley sides need to be well drained. So you often find these grips and drains between these forestry sites going straight down the valley, and these sites are incredibly bad in terms of increased flood risk again. The water gets off the valley sides much quicker, but you also get lots of aluminium salts that come off the coniferous forest, and they tend to make rivers much more acidic. So again, it would be lovely, 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 lovely if some of these were replaced with, you know, native hardwoods, and I know that's happening in lots of areas. So a little bit about some of the things that we do. How are we doing for time? We're nowhere near 9 o'clock yet.
Yeah, no, 1:45. You're all right.
1:45. I better speed up. But obviously people, for me, a force for good. We can mobilise the masses, we can all get together, we can do good things in rivers. And many of our rivers do respond from having the habitat manipulated. This is a little day out. We run events called river habitat workshops. We've done a few locally. We've done some on the Seven Kings stream with Francis Castro, who I think is...
Yeah, he's speaking last month.
Yeah, lovely guy.
Yeah.
And, you know, getting together with conservation volunteers, groups to get in and actually do things to rivers to make them better. And here, this is a piece of chalk stream near Amersham, was it? Amersham, Chesham? Hemel Hempstead, that's right. And the river was massively over wide and had been over engineered. And here we're putting a new bank in, hazel faggot bundles, packing it with brushwood, doing a little bit of tree work to let a bit of light in, and then hopefully we'll get a few more plants growing up through here. So, as I say, people, a force for good, and we get receptive groups. This is the Liss Conservation Volunteers, a little local group near to me, and they look after this little river here. They're not fish people like me. They just got this lovely corridor with a little meandering stream. They're doing work on trees, woodland meadows, just to try and improve biodiversity. They do their bird counts every year. And when I go and talk to them about river management, they're an incredibly receptive group, and everything I seem to sort of tell them seems to sink in, which makes my life a lot easier, and they get on and they do things. Whereas I get sceptical groups. This is no one here from the Test and Inching Association? Good? Okay. I didn't think there would be, but they are hardened, crusty old anglers, used to managing the rivers in a way that have been managed since they were children and their children's children, and trying to actually encourage them to think that the river test could be better than it actually is a tough ask, very difficult. And this is an example of inappropriate fisheries management carried out by a group that you would think would want rivers in good condition. This is a piece of chalk stream called the River Itchen. It's a site of special scientific interest. It's more than that. It's a special area of conservation, an example of the best of the best. And for me, if you didn't know it, you'd think, well, is that a bit of the Grand Union Canal? Maybe it should be a chalk stream. And it's been subjected to Victorian chalk stream management, which basically the old keepers used to do a thing called putting the river to bed in the autumn, which basically means strimming it to death. So anything that grows just gets cut off, and in the spring you get a little tussock of sedge if you're lucky. The irony of this site is that it's owned by the Hampshire and Isle of Wight Wildlife Trust. The fishing club are tenants. They've been tenants for about, or they were, I should say, for about 25 years. The owners, when they left the reserve and the river in their will to the Wildlife Trust, and the Wildlife Trust inherited this lot who look after the river. So the Wildlife Trust said to the fishing club, do you think you could be a little bit softer in your maintenance and management, please, because we're quite interested in birds and plants and water voles, not just fish. And unfortunately the fishing club were a little bit stupid because they didn't listen, and there was a lot of arguing that went on for about 3 or 4 years, and eventually the Wildlife Trust, quite rightly, went red card, you're off, you know, we don't want you anymore. I have absolutely no problem with that at all, but the problem then was that the fishing club, who were let's put it this way, they had 1 or 2 quite influential people they knew. So much so that this news, you might not recall it, but this actually popped up on the 9 o'clock news, BBC One. Fishing club gets expelled. Prince of Wales writes a letter to the Wildlife Trust saying, what are you doing expelling this fishing club that have been tending this chalk stream for the last 25 years? You bullies, you brutes. An almighty row ensued. Everyone got hurt. No one was talking to each other. The net result was that the Wildlife Trust went on and started to manage the reserve. but there was no fly fishing on the Abbots Barton fishery. I missed one thing out really, which is quite important. The Abbots Barton fishery was the birthplace of one particular type of fly fishing, nymph fishing. A chap called, a Victorian gentleman called Mr. Skews, used to come out of London, get off the train at Winchester, and he used to fly fish at Abbots Barton. He wrote this book, which many anglers think is one of the Bibles of fly fishing. So much so that anglers from America, Japan, New Zealand come to Winchester to look at Abbots Barton, the birthplace of nymph fishing. This is a disaster. We've got no fishing on Abbots Barton. Luckily, eventually, and it took them a while, I have to say, and I was really pushing quite hard, the Wildlife Trust have managed to find new tenants, and the new tenants have completely worked hard with the Wildlife Trust to turn this into a fantastic chalk stream. They no longer stock any fish like the old fishing club used to do, or stream it. They manage it as a wild fishery, and it's been a fantastic success. So that's a very long-winded way of me saying that nature conservation and angling can and should be compatible, but some fishermen need a good kicking now and then. Right. Many of our rivers, as I say, have this legacy of modification. Yeah, it's a bit tricky to see there, but many of our rivers, if you walk them, you'll notice between what should be the meadow and the floodplain and the river, there's often this telltale hump. And you've probably seen it. Now sometimes that hump is there because it's the run into a mill. The millers used to build these to so that they could actually impound the river higher, so that they get more energy for milling. But most of them are a legacy of sort of post-war dredging. So every 3 or 4 years, the River Board, the Water Authority, then the National River Authority, and even the Environment Agency used to come along with their 360 or their drag line, put it in the river, dump the contents of the river on the riverbank to create this mound. This has been proven on 99% of rivers to be a total waste of time for flood defence and is incredibly damaging for the ecology of the river. Rivers will recover over time if you let them, and all we do as a trust is nudge rivers. We work with natural processes. I talked a little bit about large woody material. This is a great example again of what they do. This is on a little chalk stream called the Anton. That was the only piece of interesting woody material I found in this piece of chalk stream, because the riverkeeper who'd been there for 30 years, 1 year of experience 30 times, I have to say, on the same little bit of channel, and it wasn't his fault, but his boss was very keen on the river being tidy. And the old riverkeeper, when I came across this little piece of wood here, said, "Oh," I said, "I apologise about that." He said, "I'd have had that out, but we don't own that little bit of land over the fence." And I said, "Well, have you not noticed actually that under there is about the best lie you've got on the whole fishery for a trout, and here you've actually got somewhere where fish will spawn, and it's all there because of that. Please don't take it out." And wood works in so many other ways, even when it's lying parallel to the channel like that. What tends to happen is that certain species of river-borne flies, they come out as adults, particularly some species of sedge, what we call the adult caddies. They land on the wood, they crawl underneath, and they lay their eggs on the wet side underneath. The other thing about this material is, of course, it's a meal for grazing bugs. Shrimp, caddis, as the wood gets soft, they'll graze away and gnaw at it. So we all know, as conservationists, that wood piles in the bottom of a woodland is great for wildlife. Absolutely no different in a river. So it's just a case of making sure it's secure. So I put a lot of material in river channels, and the Environment Agency are very keen that I don't lose any of that, so that it gets picked up and causes a problem downstream, and that can be an issue. The other thing about fallen trees is that they can be incredibly stable. They sometimes go over, like this one. which has gone over parallel to the bank. It's got this lovely undercut here, a great hidey hole for fish. But you can tell that's been down for years because that's a side branch. And it's not just the big lumps of wood. This is what we call coarse woody material or brash. This could be a little bit of goat willow, sallow, or something like elder. Anything that's tangly and fine in the margin like that, fantastic for bugs, fantastic for fish. It also squeezes the channel, so the flow velocities are slightly faster here, so that works on a whole range of levels. I don't begrudge fish-eating birds having a few, it's great, but we want to build that pyramid from the bottom. Lots of fish in the channel, plenty of fish-eating birds. So it's important to manage riverside trees in terms of light as well. Trees play an important role in keeping our river channels cool. The Forestry Commission have done a really good bit of research about that, and there's no doubt about it. Even on a flowing river, you wouldn't think so, but even sort of 50 or 100 metres of shade will drag the water temperature down, sometimes by a degree or more. And in a time when we can only expect our rivers to get warmer in the summer, when we'll get more evaporation, if we want to preserve more oxygen in the water and some of our cool water species, then we're going to need to think very carefully about shade and managing shade. Conversely, light is important because without some sunlight you don't get primary production, you don't get algae, if you don't get algae you don't get zooplankton, and if you don't get any light you don't get rooted macrophytes, you don't get rooted plants. So dappled light and shade is the way to go. And sometimes, you know, in their desire to get more light to the river, this is a good example of what not to do. This was a long reach of mature, mainly alder, but there's some sort of sycamores in there as well. And the fishing club there paid a contractor to go along and they coppiced the whole lot to the ground. There was about a good couple of 100 metres coppiced to the ground. What they forgot was that in coppicing it to the ground, unless you go in and recoppice, you're going to ultimately end up with more shade than you had before, because rather than a big mature tree with one trunk, you get multi-stalls and you get lots of low shade. The river channel itself actually goes back to here, so it's all cascading over in dense shade. So the thing is, by all means, coppice some of the trees out that will coppice. Things like alder really lends itself to coppice. You preserve the root systems, and actually you preserve the trees sometimes, because if they get too tall and leggy they blow over, whereas if you coppice then the tree will last a lot longer. But leave landscape trees, big trees, for blocks of shade as well. How are we doing for time?
Yeah, but just coming up 2 minutes to 9, so if you get a suitable spot, it'll be great.
Okay. Just a few examples of the way that we install wood to actually try and make channels better. Whoops, I'll go back. So we do this, we call this hinging. It's basically hedge laying in a river. Just take a saw to the back of a willow, keel it over, stake it in, maybe cut the end off. This little chap here is called a tree sweeper. We've just cut that off there and we've cabled that to its own trunk so that it'll just swing around. Great place, wagtails love these. They just sit on there, right at water level. Anything that's near and close to the water they absolutely adore. And again, it's a great place for fish to slide and out of. A few more examples of how we peg wood in. And if we haven't got trees, we actually import them. We'll cut them from further upstream, float them downriver, key them into the bank, bit of chestnut, wire them in, and there's one of my modified nails. I make nails out of steel reinforcing bar, just weld a washer over the top, drill a hole in the wood and just nail it to the bed. And you'll notice that I've put that square or just slightly upstream to the flow, and the reason is that you always get erosion at right angles to the structure. A lot of people put these things, flow deflectors, in pointing downstream, and all that does is make the channel wider, because if the flow deflector's at that angle, bearing in mind the river's flowing this way, it will push the flow towards the bank. It actually erodes the bank. That may be what you want to do, but not many people want to erode the bank. This is a thing called a brushwood shelf, and we use these to increase the sinuosity of a channel. So that's on the inside of a bend. It will naturally accrete and collect fine sediment. Plants will grow through it. A good way of actually increasing the windiness of a channel that's been heavily modified. I've got one slide of a local river. This is the Roding, and I went along. This isn't a success story, I'm afraid. I went along to give some advice to some rangers there. We were all set to do some work here to try and resolve this issue of erosion on the outside of the bend. Some of this has been exacerbated by doggy dipping, people going in and out the channel. It's mainly because it's inappropriate plants. Banks and river banks that look like this just don't erode. When you actually try and just plant grass on the top of a soft bank, it will erode out, particularly on the outside of the bend. It was interesting because we applied for consent to actually put brushwood all the way down the inside of here, and unbelievably we couldn't get consent from the Environment Agency to do it. The reason being, apparently one of the local engineers said, well, we put concrete blocks, and you could see the remains of the blocks here in there, so if the concrete blocks aren't going to work, why would brushwood? So I was a bit cross about that. I think that particular engineer's moved on. I dare say if we reapplied, we might get consent. That's an example of what we would do. Pack that face with brushwood, stakes in the toe of the bank, stakes at the back, all wired down so it can't lift off. That's incredibly stable, and of course that will collect any sediment that drops off the bank, collect sediment from the river in flood, and gradually you'll get a new toe of the bank developing. Should we pause for a drink?
Yeah, good idea.
A little bit about backwater habitat, critically important for birds, but this is a lovely little example of a sort of a cattle drinker and a little shallow bay. It looks pretty insignificant. The actual river bank is here, comes in here, little bay, and out here. So obviously this is shallow, warms up. Mr. Cow comes down there and drinks. I do know a chap actually did an MSc looking at cattle. There's a lovely fact I've got for you. Apparently a cow is 6 times more likely to have a poo if it's standing in water than if it's on the bank. And there's a nice bit of research that's proved that. Must have been a very boring summer, But the point about that is that these little areas here, when they get sunlight on them and a little bit of nutrient, you get algae and you get lots of zooplankton, and so these are often crammed with coarse fish fry, things like minnows, roach, dace, chub. It's not particularly a trout habitat, but these work incredibly well on these lowland nutrient-rich rivers. And in a lot of areas, there just are not many backwaters because we don't allow rivers to form natural oxbows anymore because we take the trees out too soon. And because landowners get absolutely paranoid if the river moves, we don't allow them to actually form backwater habitat. But we can easily make them, and we do. I don't know if you can see that black, can you see that? You probably can't from the back. There's a little like black speckling there. That's just zillions of small fish. I'm going to finish off just with a few case studies, projects that the Wild Trout Trust has delivered over the last few years, just to give you a bit of a flavour of the work we do. The first one we're kicking off with is the River Stour at Goddington, which is near, this is just upstream of Ashford in Kent. Obviously Ashford has had a huge amount of development, but the Stour's a nice little river. Sorry, go back one. For us, I talked about people. We're such a small charity, we can't do things without local champions, people who are passionate about their local river. And I say local because this chap is actually from this part of the world. He's a Romford man. I say he is, and sadly, this is Paul Bates, he died last year. But every river needs a river champion, and this guy put his heart and soul in trying to improve that piece of the Stour. I love his family were chuffed I got that slide. I sent it
Just
to
you down in the bottom corner.
that's me. Yeah, that's not a very good slide. Who's the photographer? Yeah, that would have been perfect if that had been. But anyway, Paul was quite a passionate fisherman, and the little club had improved one short section of this river, but the top end of it looked like this, which you couldn't really see the river channel. I think you'd say that the river here is a bit of a basket case, certainly basket making material. And the reason it's like that is because it's been over dredged, and every year, every 3 or 4 years, the Environment Agency would come in and just cut the reed out with what they call a Bradshaw bucket, which is a big excavator bucket with reciprocating blades, and dump this material on the bank. And I think even the engineers were realising that this was a thankless task. It's a fairly, this piece here is a rural area. There's absolutely no reason why the river couldn't come out on the banks. In fact, upstream of here there's a great big structure called a hydro break, which is designed to store water in the upper catchment and protect Ashford from flooding. But the channel would just get choked every summer with emergent reeds. And to make matters worse, where material used to collect on the structure upstream, it used to get raked off and then flow down. And just about under that tree there was about a 30-metre long festering compost heap in the middle of the channel, because although the channel's open where the channel's shaded and there is some flow, it just gets clogged up in amongst all these reeds. So it was a terrible piece of river. But I designed a little scheme which was quite bold, which was to raise the riverbed by an average of about 300 millimetres and to push the banks in with this mighty machine here, a sort of a 30-ton, 17-metre excavator, which could actually work on the field, reach over the top and work in the channel. We had 2,000 tonnes, that's 80 20-tonne lorry loads through one farm gate, which made me a little bit nervous. And this was gravel that we purchased from a local quarry, and Paul did an amazing job to negotiate the price of this gravel. I think it came in at about £16 a tonne. If I'd have picked up the phone and called them, I'd have been charged probably £27 a tonne delivered. But it made a huge difference to the economics of the project. And basically we just scraped the reeds to one side with a bucket, squished them into the margin, raised the bed with gravel, and then created this pool and run regime. I was staggered when we got the reeds out that how much of a gradient there was actually in the channel, and that we actually got a flowing system. And within a year, we transformed the channel from being full of reeds to having this plant. This is flowering water crowfoot, ranunculus, which is a classic chalk stream species. And you can tell this is the very same area which was just a complete reed bed. Don't get me wrong, I don't want people to go away from here thinking that I hate reed beds. Reed beds are wonderful. And emergent reeds are wonderful in a river, particularly when they protect the margins. They're just not terribly wonderful when they're completely in the middle of the channel and choke it off completely. And that's what the channel looked like a year after that. And these pieces of wood, they're just designed to kick the flow around. This is all flowering ranunculus. So we've got a lovely little stream back, and we've got wild trout back at Gorrington following this project. That project was funded. There was several funders. The Environment Agency were really chuffed with it, and bless them, they put some money into a further phase of work, because there was 500 metres of channel right at the very bottom of the Goddington estate, which was in a similar condition. That was it prior to any work. We had a slightly different recipe this time. We didn't have quite as much gradient to play with, but what we did there again, we pushed the margin back in with the blade of the bucket, and we accentuated the meanders with brushwood, and again we introduced quite a lot of gravel. And put in some cattle drinks, and also kept the cattle out of the river, because not only were they grazing everything off in sight, but obviously when you get heavy cattle in the river, they poach and trample the bank down. A bit of light trampling and poaching is a good thing. We don't want the banks to be all the same, but in order to get the river to recover, we needed to do a little bit of fencing. So to restore the full 2 kilometres of channel cost about £50,000, which you might think is an awful lot of money. I think it's good value because it no longer needs any heavy maintenance work. Second case study is a local river to me, the Western Rother, which is a tributary of the Arun in West Sussex. And this is typical of a lot of the projects that we get involved in, because we buddied up with a Rivers Trust. I don't know if you were aware, but Rivers Trusts have mushroomed all around the country on the back of a piece of legislation called the Water Framework Directive, which is a wonderful piece of legislation. For all of you fans of Brexit, I would say, wouldn't I, that the European legislation that protects rivers is incredibly powerful and works extremely well. And I'm really worried that if we lose some of those European directives, whether we'll lose the ability to protect some of our very vulnerable rivers. Shouldn't get political here, Boris would tell me off. But it's true. But basically the funding to carry out some work here came out via the Water Framework Directive, via DEFRA, and the Rivers Trust, my local Rivers Trust, were very enthusiastic, but lacking in, and I think they'd agree, in a little bit of river experience, brought us in to help them with this project. And we designed a scheme to create a spawning site for flow-loving gravel spawning fish. And for that we needed stones, because all the stones and gravel had been dredged out of this river. And we bought a lot of stones, like we got 400 tonne of local ragstone and 600 tonne of gravel, and we put that into a mere 60 metre long section of channel. Now you might think when you put that lot into the river that you're going to raise the level by a lot. We actually raised the water level upstream by about 2.5 centimetres as a result of all of that going into 60 metres of channel. Because of course what you do when you put it in is you elevate the flow velocity. You've got the same flow going down the river over a different cross section. So I'll go back. So suddenly you've got a river that moves, and we've got this lovely ramp of gravel. So this area here is all phenomenal spawning habitat. Lovely broken riffle and a little pool at the end. And we did a pre-survey there to work out what the biomass of fish that were inhabiting the river before, and it was really poor. And the very next day that this gravel was put in, we didn't have a post-project survey organised. I wish I had, because I don't know if you can see that shape there. That's a sea trout, about 7 pounds, that arrived the very first day and said, do you know what, I quite like some stones out of my bottom. I'm going to sit there because it feels like a river. Part of the same project, we created one of those backwaters I was talking about. This is the main river here. Actually, this is the outside of a bend. Now, you wouldn't normally think about putting a backwater on the outside of a bend, but you do naturally sometimes get what's called a hammerhead pool, and you get these features that form on the outside neck of the pool. The farmer was incredibly generous, having knocked farmers all evening. This particular one was a diamond, and he sacrificed about an acre of his prime grazing there to give us this piece of land. Because to make a backwater the size of this room, we needed about an acre of land because of the height of the banks. Because you have to, you can't have vertical sides, you have to have natural battered banks. So 3 days of digging, and that's the height of the bank there. We put all the material, it has to come out of the floodplain. But ultimately you end up with something that looks like that. here's the riverbank here. This would have been the outside of the bend. This is the backwater. That's a view from the other side. This is the little drinking bay that we're going to put in, or we were just about to put in. And that's what it looked like a year later. And that's some conservation volunteers from the South Downs Park Authority working with me, to put in just a little bit of brushwood as a spawning medium.
That's all just natural growth.
No, that's material that's just cut and laid in. So that's just local hazel, just cut in bundles and laid in. Now, that's been surveyed since, and obviously there was no fish there before because there was Frisians there before. And some contractors ran a little fine mesh seine net through there and recorded 7 different species of fish in that one little pool. So I'm highly delighted with that.
Is that what they call surf and turf?
Could be. My last example is a little project I did last year, a little bit more pertinent probably to urban river channels. This is a river called the Monks Brook, which is an urban river. It drains Chandler's Ford and Eastleigh. Basically you've got right next to Eastleigh Airport, and this is about a couple of 100 metres from the M27, and the whole of the riverbed, you can't see, is lined with concrete, but the concrete goes there, under there, and it goes up the other side. It was a sort of a 1960s river improvement scheme. In places, sediment has actually accreted on the channel, and there are 15, 20-foot trees precariously growing on top of this concrete, really shallow rooted. But there's no pool habitat. You can walk for about 600 metres in a pair of wellies, and it's all exactly the same depth. Well, I say same depth because you've got these little shoals of gravel that have appeared. There are some bits that are just a tad deeper than others. What happened here was that the Highways Agency were doing a road scheme. They needed consent from the Environment Agency. The Environment Agency always look for environmental gain when they're commenting on or giving consents. And they said to the Highways Agency or their contractors, yes, we'll allow you to extend this bridge culvert, but you're going to be damaging habitat in doing so. How are you going to mitigate for that? And they said, well, we don't know. And so we were teamed up with the Highways Agency to design a little scheme using their highway contractors while they were on site. So obviously they wanted to get away with as little as possible because they didn't want to spend too much money. I wanted as much as possible, and I wanted some of this concrete out for shore. And you can see how cheesed off that guy looks. That was the first day, and we didn't have a clue how easy or difficult it was to get this concrete out. And the machine that we had, bearing in mind you have to track this machine up the river about 300 metres because there's only underneath one of the road bridges. And I think we've been doing this for about an hour, and this was so hard, this concrete, before the tip snapped off of that little breaker. So we were off site then for another day, and they came back with a bigger machine and an even more grumpy driver, and but a bigger pecker. And we started getting, and you can see it's all reinforced. This is all steel rods all holding it in place. And we were just freeing up the river back to the natural bed, and I thought, God, what's underneath this lot? You know, and it was very difficult to tell what the local geology was going to be like. I really hoped there would be lots and lots of this stuff. In fact, I wanted them to dig me 5 good-sized pools. We eventually ended up agreeing that they would do 3 because it took them so long. But the top and the bottom pool were about 90% gravel underneath the concrete, and the middle pool, it was more marl, but there was some gravel as well. So scooped it all up, and then that all went out on dumpers, and eventually we had this. We had these lovely little run-ins. Now that the stream is rock bottom flow here. This is about late September, October time. If you went down there now, that would be whistling through there, and that's a lovely, lovely deep, cool pool. And at the bottom of the pool, we've got this lovely ramp of gravel, which is great for spawning. So we've made this sort of natural sequence. We know sea trout come running up from the Itchen and run into the Monk's Brook to spawn, even in this urban environment. I've probably bored you all to death.
No, you do. Well,
That was my last slide, actually. This is just a slide of my favourite ever advisory visit. I was sent out in the first week I started with the Wild Trout Trust to give advice on the great laxer in Iceland. I thought, why do they want habitat advice on a wilderness environment, the most incredible rivers? But I wasn't going to say I wasn't going to go. Thank you very much for listening.
thank you. Right, thank you for that. Any questions? Jeff?
Beavers.
Beavers.
Good, bad, indifferent.
We had a little chat about beavers at tea break. I've got to keep an open mind about beavers. I'm a bit worried about beavers. I'll tell you why I'm worried about them. There's been some research carried out on the impact that beavers have on river ecology in Scotland, and the results are very favourable in terms of them creating some decent habitat. Those systems are quite steep, and when you put a lodge or a little dam across a steep gradient stream, you're only going to back it up for 20 or 30 metres. If you put a lodge in a lowland chalk stream, you might back it up for a mile. So I'm a little bit worried that Mr. Beaver might build his lodges in some rather inconvenient places. Now, that's not a reason to say that we don't want them. It's just a reason to be cautious. The other thing I would say, for all those that love the idea of rewilding, and I've been involved in a few rewilding projects on various estates around the country, and they're interesting because everyone wants to rewild with everything other than the top predators. They're very nervous about European lynx or wolves even. But of course, with Mr. Beaver, he evolved the European beaver in this country side by side with the top predator, which was actually us, because we always probably quite fancied if not eating a bit of beaver, certainly wearing it post-Ice Age. So the beaver would have been on its toes, and probably the numbers would have been sustainable. I hear from some parts of Eastern Europe where beavers have been released or previously missing, that what beavers do very well as felling trees, is making small beavers. And the British public, as they are, they're sometimes very, very reluctant to use the management word. You know, what are we going to do if we get lots and lots of beaver? Do we just think, oh, they're cute, don't we love them? Or do we, get rid of one or two? I don't know. I'm going to keep a really open mind about beaver. It's exciting, and I think they've got potential. I'd love a bit of science in some lowland catchments and see what that looks like.
Very pertinent to this, we're going to Walthamstow wetlands
Yep.
Saturday morning, and when I last went there, they are dredging the Coppermill stream, which was there hundreds of years to run
It's an
Coppermill.
aqueduct, isn't it? Yeah. Isn't it an aqueduct? Wasn't it an artificial channel, the Coppermill stream? Am I right in that or
Oh,
not?
I don't think so.
It's not a natural channel, I don't think. It's a bit.
Ah,
There's
I'm
one
not
or two
sure.
channels in London. It's like the Duke of Northumberland River that
Yeah.
runs into the Crane.
Well,
Everyone thinks it's a natural river, and it's about 300 years old. It's
it is very old, but
Yeah.
I mean, they are currently dredging it,
are they?
and this is to get the silt
Yep.
to put in the reservoirs to make reed beds.
Is it?
Now he said to me, maybe I'm wrong, maybe so I want to ask that, they were going to dredge down to 11 feet. Is that something?
I'm visualising the Grand Canyon here.
I must have misheard. But is there a reason why you want a deep flowing river? Because obviously it's not for trout.
Well, it is. Well, actually, trout love deep pools. But of course, this is why the trout's a great indicator species, and indeed many others, because the adults like deep pools, but when they want to make other trout, they need shallow gravel riffles. So you need riffly water, shallows, and pools. So deep water's not bad on its own, but what for me is bad is when rivers are managed by us in a way that makes them uniformity is the death knell of ecology in rivers, as far as I'm concerned. They need to be varied in terms of their shape, either their plan form, the way they wiggle, or the bed topography. The analogy I use is I think rivers that have a bottom like an egg box are always much more valuable than one like a flat floor.
More questions then on Saturday if I managed to find
So
them.
make sure it's got a bottom like an egg box.
How big a problem are mink now? Are any winning on mink?
Absolutely. If groups want to, mink are the most inquisitive, dull animal in the world. They are very, very easy to trap. Now, there are several catchments I can think of where conservation groups have been desperately keen to reintroduce and re-establish water vole, but of course you can't do that until you've got on top of mink. And the way they do it is with mink rafts. Do you know about mink rafts? Well, it's inhumane, it's illegal actually, just to put traps out and not check them every day. And of course, it's pretty soul destroying putting a trap out, checking it for 200 days and not finding anything in it. So if you put a mink raft down, which is just a little bit of plasticine in a cover, the mink goes in, walks on the plasticine, and you can tell, you can check it once a month, once a week, and as soon as you start seeing footprints, you think, okay, take the plasticine out, put the trap in, and you catch Mr. Mink. There's some really good research on a few rivers showing that actually, with some concerted effort, you can actually keep them out of the catchment, and then once you get vole reintroduced, provided you've got habitat for vole, they do really well. There's a big project going on down near me at the moment on the River Meehan with the Parks Authority and the Hampshire Wildlife Trust, and they're having great success.
What about coypu? Are they gone now?
Well, I've never seen one, but
have
you?
Yeah,
I think coypu were.
Norfolk Broads was
Yeah,
a
but
place for them.
They were, but I got a feeling that they were trapped to extinction. I'm pretty sure they don't exist anymore in this country.
One comment is otters don't well like mink, presumably, because they taste nice to otters. So they're presumably having some beneficial effects.
Absolutely.
The other one is another invasive species is the signal crayfish.
I didn't even touch on non-native species tonight, and to be honest, it's a whole talk on its own, isn't it? In terms of plants that are causing a problem on rivers, you know, things like Himalayan balsam, giant hogweed, knotweed, floating pennywort, you know. Victorian gardeners have got a lot to answer for. But you're absolutely right, you know, and I've been lucky enough, when I first started working on rivers in the southeast, I never dreamt that there would be otter back in the southeast. And now it's almost rare to go to a catchment where they're not back. Now I know they've had a helping hand on many catchments, you know, they've come out the boot of a car, but they are coming back naturally as well, and you're right, they are a top predator. You're not going to see many, but I have seen them. I've seen them mainly when I've been down in Wales on Welsh rivers, and it's such a joy to get a sight of an otter on a British river. Whoa, fantastic.
And are they counterproductive in your other work, or do they help?
Well, otter, in fact, they eat trout. For me, if you've got an apex predator at the top of the system, it's an endorsement that I'm doing my job.
Yeah.
So the thing is, with nothing works harder than it needs to survive. So if the ecology of the river does not support good fish population, then the otter needs a very big territory, and you're not going to see it very often. I have to say there are a few places in Hampshire where they don't have to move very far because there's still quite a few fish farms, which the fish farmers don't quite take the same attitude as well.
Having said that, me and the wife used to visit a place up in Scotland that were totally anti the ospreys, and then suddenly they realised there was a fortune to be made out of it up in the Candle. They got hides all round their fish lakes now, and they charge your cameraman a fortune to sit there taking photographs of these things fishing. And they run the two things together now.
They're amazing. And of course, you don't even have to go up to your Rutland to see them. You can.
That's it.
You can see. I see them quite often and on migration, obviously.
Yeah.
But what a sight!
Yeah.
Yeah, fantastic.
Does all your work in rivers that are non-tidal, do you ever go into tidal areas or?
Well, we've got an interest in tidal areas because obviously with sea trout, but the reality is with tidal areas, you know, our expertise is in habitat management and manipulation. There's not a lot of scope for us in tidal zones other than on what we call tidal flaps, perched rivers that drop tributaries that drop down into tidal reaches that often have a flap on them. The flaps are there for a reason, because obviously they're mainly there to stop saltwater flooding, but they're a real issue for fish. But what you can do, you can modify the tidal flap so that it opens for just a tad longer than it would otherwise do, and just enough to allow fish through. So we give advice on those, but other than that, not a lot on tidal reaches.
Richard?
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking that you really ought to get involved with the river roading again, because pathways are in a real mess. They're completely choked with weeds, and I've noticed they're doing, contrary to your advice, dredging it all out and dumping the spoil on the banks.
Yeah.
Can I just ask you, I mean, the techniques that you use, how did these sort of originate and evolve, and are they generally used elsewhere?
Well, some of them are, and to be honest, it's like a lot of things, you know, a lot of our ideas come from across the pond, actually. The Americans, obviously, they spent a long time on habitat management, so some of their ideas have filtered over. The internet's a fabulous tool as well, of course. When I first started working on rivers in our office, we never even had a flipping computer, let alone the internet. And you know, you made it up. And I've done some horrible things to rivers in the past that I wouldn't be at all proud of today, and I would own up to if someone said, "Did you do that?" And you learn from other people. And I've had some complete disasters, and I've had some amazing successes. And you just, after a while, you get a feel for it, and the only thing I would say, the critically important thing is you can never make a river do what it doesn't want to do. But if you understand how these natural processes work, it's like on the Stour with all that emergent reed growth. If you treat a river and manage it like a sediment-filled ditch, it's going to look like a sediment-filled ditch. You know, if you can get it moving again with a firm bed, then you'll get different plants, and it'll be self-cleansing. You'll get the energy and it'll move some of those that sediment through. That said, you know, the sediment's got to go somewhere. It has to settle somewhere. So it's a combination of getting the channel right, but as I alluded to earlier on, there's so much more that needs to be done in the floodplain. So that's also very, very important.
Okay, anybody else? Did I see Jeff put your hand up a minute ago? No, you're alright? Yeah.
Borderline to submit.
Okay, so I've got one heathen question of my own then. Have we got any decent trout recipes?
I could tell you. I have to say, I adore eating sea trout. They are the most. I can't bear to kill one. I just can't do it. So, yeah.
Well, I guess a lot of these fishermen you work with, they take them home and...
Well, you'd be surprised, our membership, the Wild Trout Trust, as the name suggests, 99% of our members put everything they catch back.
Right.
They are conservationists, and they are very, very passionate about... There's a lot of trout anglers out there, they're fishing for the table, there's no doubt about it, but many fisheries are managed on a what's called a put and take basis. Long swathes of rivers like the River Test, for instance, and the landowners like to think, we've got the finest trout fishery in the world, and I tell them, well, actually you haven't, because it's only sustained by stocking, and they've fundamentally forgotten that you need habitat to sustain wild fish. So I've got no problem with smacking a farm trout on the head and having dinner.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think that's been brilliant. It's been a nice change, and I certainly thoroughly enjoyed it.
Well, I'm sorry there was only one bird in there.
Yeah,